Okay. And hi, Richard. Do I have your consent to have this interview recorded today on Zoom?
Yes, you do.
Thank you so much. So, broadly, our questions will ask you about your background, personal and activist life history, and then your personal perspectives. So, first, let's talk about a little about you and your family background. When and where were you born?
Well, that's a little bit complicated and fun, actually. As I like to say, I was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States. So my mother left 7 months pregnant with me from Cuba, and so in some ways, I kind of was made in Cuba, but I think my soul was formed in Cuba. And I was born in Madrid, and then 45 days after I was born, we emigrated once again to the United States. So I was an immigrant by 45 days old, and eventually we moved first to New York, then finally to Miami, where I was born and where I was raised most of my life and educated. So, so I belonged to three countries by the time I was 45 days old, and yet to none.
I love that wording. It's like the words are so deliberate, but it really says a lot about like migrations and migration patterns.
Yep, yeah.
And what is your mother's name? And where? What did she do for a living? And where was she born?
So my mother's name is Geysa, which is a kind of an odd name, beautiful name, Geysa. uh, and she was born in Las Villas in Santa Clara, Cuba, raised in a small town along where my father was also raised, a small sugar mill town just outside of Cienfuegos, Cuba. My mother was the youngest of eight siblings, grew up in a dirt floor home, very rural Cuba. And because she was the eighth, there was a little more money to go around and time. And so she studied. She was able to go to the university, the only one of her eight siblings. And she was very determined too. This is something that later on she stressed in my life was education, education, education. But yeah, she became a teacher. And sort of middle school to high school teacher. Actually got the PED, I think they call it. She went all the way to get almost what is a master's, or back then was kind of considered a PhD in education. But then when she came to the United States, because of the language barrier, she ended up becoming a bank teller and eventually had a whole career in banking, which was interesting. And she tells me now, she's like, I think I would have liked to be an accountant rather than a teacher. So who knows, right? But she just did it to survive. And so that's what she ended up doing.
Nice. I can relate. My mother was a teacher back in the Dominican Republic. And so she was so strict about our schooling here. Like, I remember when I was younger, if my homework was sloppy, I had to like redo it three times over. And I think it really instilled like this ethic of education and this passion, this low key. She credits me wanting to be a professor to her being a teacher. And I'm like, sure, mom. Yep. Yep. That's it.
Yeah, yeah, she was very, very strict with and also just the expectation was like, what, an A minus? No, you know, what are you going to do about that? So, yeah, that I think now that I think about it as well, I think that's partly why I just love learning of all kinds, right? I think that's how I ended up becoming from a poet. I mean, from an engineer to a poet eventually, but I'm sure we'll get into that later.
We definitely will. And how about your father? What is his name and what did he do for a living?
So my father's name was Carlos Emilio. I forgot my mother's full name is Gesa Claudia Valdez. My father is Carlos Emilio Blanco. He was also born and raised in the same region as my mother and lived in the same town. He was actually a Navy guy in the Cuban Navy before the Communist Revolution, the Socialist Revolution, and he missed graduating from the Naval Academy by a few days because they threw everybody out after the change in regime. So, so he actually was, interestingly enough, was what we call a port pilot, or was studying to be a port pilot within the Navy, which is um, really interesting. I didn't learn that this till I was in my 20s. Nobody told me. But in every port, there's the port captain who actually brings in the ships and brings out the ships because they know the port. So Um, if you've ever been on a cruise and you see this little boat coming alongside as you're leaving and someone jumps off the boat, that's the port pilot who takes the ship out to sea. And then the captain of the boat takes over. But he also ended up, when he was kicked out of the army, he ended up working in the sugar mill in the town where my grandfather had worked most of his life since he was 13 and worked himself up to become kind of like an accountant, but really kind of a bookkeeper. And so by trade, my grandfather taught him what he knew. And eventually, when he came to the United States, besides working odd jobs in a bomb factory and as a butcher and all these other things, he ended up becoming working as an accountant, but really a bookkeeper because he never had a degree in accounting or licensed as an accountant.
And do you know how your parents met?
Yeah, there's a funny story about that. So my mother always was attracted to very tall men, supposedly. She always wanted to marry a really tall, like man. My dad is 5'5". I'm 5'10". Like my brother's 5'10" as well. It's weird. But then my father was a little more well off than my mother, still rural and pretty poor, but they did have a car. And then my mother, when she was going to school, to university, she would walk or take her horse or whatnot, and they would always offer her a ride, and she just refused all the time. Like she was like, no, no, thank you very much, no, no, thank you very much. And finally, she said yes one day and got in the car, and I think that was where the romance began.
And you mentioned having a brother who was tall. How many brothers and sisters do you have, and where do you fall in that order?
We're only two, so I'm the youngest of the two. My brother is 6.5 years older than me. My brother was born in Cuba and was there till he was 6.5 years old or so. So he has a very different sort of relationship with Cuba, a very different experience. For him, I think it was more traumatic in the sense of he gets to Spain and they put him in some public school in Spain and everybody's talking Spanish from Spain with all the papers. And then like a few months later, they throw him in some PS 192 in New York City, pin his name and address and phone number on his shirt without not knowing a single word in English. So for him, I think it was a different source of experience. He finally went back to Cuba way after me. And I took him there. So yeah, we're second. We're very close. Kind of a small family for Latinx fans, for a Cuban family. Yeah, and I only have one first cousin on my father's side. On my mother's side, on the other hand, she had, like I said, she had 8 brothers and sisters and was the youngest. So she has nieces and nephews that are older than her. But I grew up without any of that family because they all stayed in Cuba. So it wasn't until I was till 1994 when my first trip to Cuba that I finally got to meet this whole big family. I had to walk around with a little cheat sheet to figure out to remember who was who. But yeah, my brother and I are very close. We kind of it was kind of almost like a father figure to me because he was old enough and used to even babysit me and take me places and whatnot.
And now let's talk about the family that you've created. Do you have any children?
No, I've never had children. There was a time in my life where I did want children. In fact, because I've always been some kind of romantic fool, but I used to keep a small journal for a while in my late teens, early 20s, about to my unborn child. But I don't know exactly why that desire just sort of fell away. I think partly has to do first with my sexuality and coming out as a different generation where that, back, 22 or 30 years ago, it wasn't really as much as a possibility. But then I think my art just took up so much time and my art became my baby in a way. My art became where I put all my energy in. And I feel like, it would, I'd be doing a disservice to my art and to a child if I tried to do both at the same time. But other people have done it, that's for sure.
I'm so happy you have the relationship to your art, and I'm looking forward to getting into that deeper in a few questions. My next question for you is: are you in a relationship?
Yes, my partner is Mark, and we've been together. It's going to be 23 years in October. Yeah, we've been through thick and thin. We met, I think it was my early 30s. So, we're kind of a little bit older, and I think that's why the relationship worked out. We also had, he's a bit older, like 3 years older than me. So, yeah, we've traveled a lot, and I mean, we've lived in very many different places. It's been a kind of a really great journey, not without its difficulty, of course, like any relationship. Uh, but yeah, I think this is pretty much it.
And how did you and Mark meet?
It's a really funny and weird story. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. So, um, as I said, I grew up in Miami and pretty much as a working class kid too, right? Like I didn't travel much. I didn't know much about the world outside of the borders of Miami. And so after I graduated from my MFA and got my first book published, I went out looking for a job, which is, of course, sort of the next step, teaching creative writing at professorship. And I found I was accepted to one in Hartford, Connecticut. And I thought, I was still thinking about that quintessential sort of America that I thought existed. And I thought, oh my God, New England, Connecticut, I'm finally going to go to America. Finally going to live in America. But anyway, it ended up being a very, very sort of lonely year and a half because everything that I had known, I just took this great leap of faith. And of course, it was, that moment in your life where you just really grow up really fast and not without a lot of confusion and frustration and loneliness. And so at the time, I was just like, I'm giving this another year. And if I'm just going back to Miami, I don't care if I have to, like, whatever I need to do. I can't be in this place anymore. And then, as luck would have it, I meet him, and who we met at the gym, which is kind of stereotypical, but he he told me it was for a medical convention. So I thought it was a doctor, and I thought, oh my God, a doctor. um, and then we went out on our first date, what I thought was our first date, but actually told me that he had just gotten separated from his wife after a couple weeks and whatnot. And I was like, oh great, like this is a big hot mess here. So I kind of said, well, I guess maybe at least it'll be a friend or somebody's interesting, whatever. But anyway, it didn't quite go the platonic way that night. And so the next surprise was that he wasn't in for a medical convention. He was actually having a little nervous breakdown because of his breakup with his wife of 8 years. And I think also just dealing with his sexuality finally and whatnot. So he was actually in town an outpatient program for counseling for therapy. So, but it's interesting because we've often thought about how crazy that was and the chances of that relationship surviving. But we've seen that in some ways when people are at their lowest points in life. So that's why I kind of shared I was at a very low point. He was at a very low point. You're kind of the most honest with yourself in some ways, and you're most vulnerable, and you're not looking for that checking all the boxes, and so I think that was part of what happened. I mean, we were we were there for each other in the hardest times, and I think that created a special bond. And I've seen that with other relationships. And of course, when you're vulnerable, you could always meet the wrong person too, right? Like there's that idea of on the rebound, right? So, but yeah, we love telling that story because it's just it was heaven sent. I mean, it was God sent because really, who would think in Hartford of all places, right?
I really enjoyed the detail about the gym. Like I've heard a lot of queer romance stories begin at the gym.
Yeah.
And your stories have been so compelling. Like I think as you were talking, I felt like I was in a short film. And I was like, I was feeling so many emotions hearing about this. And I'm really holding on to when you said that when we're at our lowest point to be we're most honest with ourselves. And I'm like, that's really, it's so unfortunate, but it's also really, really true. I really agree with that.
And I think we always have those threshold moments in our lives, right? Like kind of like you shed some part of yourself and it is painful for something else to be born in you, or a new version of a new phase of your life to be born in you. And that's happens every once in a while. We go through these things.
And for some LGBT people of color, family also includes people we meet later in life. So can you tell me about one or two people you consider family in this sense?
Yeah. Yeah, as we know, we kind of make our own family, right? We don't abandon our given family, but we also have to create our own family, our own support system. One of those is my what I would consider my longest and dearest and best friend to this day, and her name is Sonia Bonilla. A New Year weekend from East Harlem, whom I met in Miami, and she was working in my engineering office, and it was from day one, just her big old Boricua eyes looked at me. I said, "Good morning," and I was like, "That's it. Yeah, we're in love." So, but she was so hip and cool. She's probably about 10 years old, 8 to 10 years older than me. I lived in Spanish Harlem, got a Studio 54. I was like, "This is the coolest person." Of course, she met me as a straight man, and so there were many years that we just hung out day and night. But it was all straight, and then she went through me through my whole coming out, and essentially, I don't know if this is politically correct anymore, but she was what we used to call back then a fag hag. She's just had a collection of gay men all around her all the time, which I was cool with, of course, but I was like, oh, I'm not that, right? So she's seen me through a lot. That's where I started writing poetry. I mean, we'd hang out every Friday. There was like, it was very New York, right? Like people would come over. It was just, house party like every Friday or Saturday. People would start playing instruments. We'd read poetry, like all sorts of crazy going on. And I think her friendship allowed me to sort of blossom eventually into accepting, and not only into sort of exploring a life in the arts and poetry and doing something more creative with myself, but also coming out as a gay man and being honest with myself finally coming out to myself first. So yeah, she's still with me. And another good friend is someone who is still with me in my life to this day. And it was a professor of history in the last class that I took in my undergraduate, uh, which was a class I had to pass, which I had postponed taking as an engineer for like 3 years. And it was on the Greeks, on the Peloponnesian Wars. And it sort of, we formed a very strong bond, but also just I left my undergraduate engineering degree knowing that having a little taste of the humanities and of literature and of history, and it stayed in my heart. And I think that's also part of where, when I wanted to do something creative, I landed back on writing. I aced the class and I was petrified because I hadn't written a sentence in like 3 years. I'd done calculus 5, but I still hadn't really written much. So he was a very positive. He's still a great friend to this day, to this very day.
That's beautiful. And how do you keep in touch with Sonia and your former professor?
Well, Sonia still lives in Miami, so every time I go to Miami, and now that I've taken a full-time professorship at my alma mater, we're going to see obviously a lot more of each other. But yeah, I travel a lot, so I to Miami, so I've seen her constantly. Always we do the same thing. We have a little party at the house. People come over, and also I forgot to mention his name was Pyron, Professor Darden Pyron. Darden Pyron. It's like, what? It's so cute. I was like, what does that name come from? And so he lived in Miami, of course, most of his life. So same idea. He's now living in Central Florida, so it's a little harder to see him. But we still maintain. We're old fashioned. He still writes letters and stuff. So he's 25 years older than me. So we keep in touch that way.
Oh my God. I'm thinking about the parties. These parties sounded, first of all, very New York, but these parties just sounded so amazing. Like just like being with people, being queer or not queer at the time, and being super artistic. But these letters, I can't imagine. I try with my friends nowadays, and I'm like, we do like videos, like video letters, or like how do I explain it? It's like videos like asynchronous FaceTime, for lack of a better word, or like video diary entries.
Right,
But a
right.
letter writing has been like, I couldn't keep up with it.
Yeah, it's hard. And so I mean, it's waned over time, obviously, ever since email started and stuff like that. But I've kept them all, and they're actually all in my literary archives. So there's a lot in there. I think he knows that, but they're all at Emory University, sitting somewhere in a box. So so that yeah, it got a little. It's funny when I could see the paper trail like die off slowly when I was looking at all. I've always kept a lot of things. I've been like a little bit of a hoarder in that regard. um, and you can see like even Christmas cards or even like birthday cards that started waning off. I have people send like just a birthday wish over text, but so that is kind of a nice record. I try to keep as many emails as I can because they're kind of correspondence. And also, that's why it's kind of hard. Email takes me forever because I see it as a letter, and I'm like formally what did I, make sure it all is pretty and makes sense and is not just blah blah blah.
And now let's talk about your educational journey. So you grew up in Miami. Where did you go to school?
I went to school first. I went to Catholic school, Roman Catholic school, all my life from kindergarten onwards. First to St. Brendan's Elementary, and then to Christopher Columbus Catholic High School for boys. So I went to an all boys Catholic high school, which was actually a great experience, believe it or not. It's interesting that one would think that as a queer guy, you would feel like really weird. And it's really interesting because there were no women around. There was none of this sort of male posturing or this hyper masculinity. Actually, they were nicer, more friendly, more like a brotherhood. Nobody, picked on anybody in that regard. Everybody kind of knew who was what, but we didn't have to, there was no posturing because there was no women around, except for a few female teachers. But anyway, and then I went to Florida International University for both degrees, for engineering degree, and then that was graduated in 1991, and then eventually went back for a master's in fine arts and creative writing, and then graduated in 1997. So I got both degrees in engineering and creative writing from the same school. And almost a third degree, I went back for a master's in architecture when I was 42, but that didn't pan out.
And so to clarify, did you get the degrees together, or did you make a career shift from like engineering towards writing full time?
No, I studied engineering, graduated as an engineer. I think that's one of the more sort of details that people really find interesting, because there's kind of this idea or narrative, right, that I studied engineering and then I discovered poetry and then I stopped being an engineer, but it's not quite like that. As a working class kid, immigrant kid, I had very little access to the arts or the humanities, especially being in a very small, poor parish, Roman Catholic parish. We didn't do much of any of the arts in there. So I just didn't even know what the possibilities were of a career in the arts or even the humanities. And I was also left brain, right brain. So this gets back to sort of what we're talking about our moms. And, I just loved everything. I just, anything you put in front of me, I was interested in. And so I was really great at math. I mean, I was actually better at math than at English, probably by hair. But I was always left brain, right brain, and I score exactly the same in all those standardized tests. So when it came to a time to pick a major, I went with engineering. Partly was also the influence of course, the immigrant work ethic and whatnot. You know, I had sacrificed all this to come here. What are you going to like we say when we tell our parents, you're going to study English, they'll say like, don't you know English already? You know, that kind of thing, right? So, but it wasn't like I hated it. I loved math, and so there was also another factor, which was my grandmother, who was my primary caretaker and lived with us, was very homophobic. So also anything that was too artsy, fartsy was kind of frowned upon and kind of ridiculed, right? Because I was a man and I had to behave like a man and do things that men did in the world, and that were meant engineering. She thought architecture was too gay. Uh, anyway, I graduated and then I started working full time as an engineer, and in my engineering office, much to my surprise, like my job was writing studies and letters and proposals for jobs, for major jobs, for $40 million jobs, and you started realizing that, you know, everything in some ways came down to some kind of oral or written communication skill, and you actually excel in your job because of that. But anyway, it tickled my fancy, so to speak. It's learning about audience and tone and diction, and I really started geeking out on language. And so I just thought, well, I knew I always wanted to do something creative in my life. I didn't know what that would be. And then I just started writing poetry, which was the one thing I knew probably the least about of anything in the world, because I'm always up for a challenge. And just started writing, just goofing around with poetry, just writing really bad poems, but really just following. I wasn't doing it to change careers. I had no expectations. I was just doing it kind of to treat myself to the luxury of doing something creative that I never had before. And as luck would have it, I think that's part of, you know, having that kind of attitude. I was dedicated, but without expectations, just purely dove into it, I think in the best of possible ways. And I think as I look back now, I think that that was part of perhaps part of my early success as a writer, was that I didn't have this sort of egoic pressure of becoming anything. I got my day job. I mean, and so, you know, sometimes, you know, the idea of like, you know, that I would have changed careers is kind of funny too, because like I always like to say, yeah, I really wanted to go into poetry full time because there was so much money in it, right? So a lot of it was just survival. Like I wasn't going to quit my engineering job to like do what, like to write poetry. But eventually, when I got my first book published, like I was saying earlier, I did take a hiatus from engineering, and and that's when I moved, took my that job as a professor in Hartford. But eventually, I migrated back to engineering because I found that for the way my brain works, I like the balance of having a day job or using my left brain and my right brain. I think, you know, when I was having a bad poetry day, I'd immerse myself in my engineering. When I was having a bad engineering day, because you have bad engineering days too, I'd write poetry at work all day. So in some ways, my engineering office financed my whole my whole poetic career. So that was a nice balance. And now that's changed again. Obviously, ever since I was asked by President Obama to be inaugural poet, presidential inaugural poet. Of course, that opened up a whole idea of career in poetry that was not possible before. But I still try to do my day job, you know, my left brain stuff, my poetry business, like, you know, the flights to here, the address to that, all the coordination, all the finances around that. I try to do that and still preserve my nighttime for just purely creative work. And I try to divide that left brain from the right brain still so I can work.
It's interesting because I think, especially sometimes, like being in a doctor in the humanities, there is kind of sometimes like a apprehension to STEM. It almost seems like STEM and like the arts are always like antithetical to each other, especially in regards to funding opportunities, in regards to schooling. So to hear you like living with that and like not even like feeling at odds or like being pulled different ways, but like finding peace with both of them and seeing their financial and like emotional benefits is like, I've never heard of someone who did both. I've always heard of people who like left engineering and never turned back. I never actually heard someone go from the arts to engineering at all, but I've always heard about all these like runaways who just like really ran from STEM like so rapidly. And I went to a high school where we specialize in engineering, and we were forced to do something of engineering. So I have like this excess of like math skills in my head. Like I can do calculus still, but I'm getting a PhD studying gender, and I'm like, this isn't working out. Like I don't know what to do this with this knowledge. But it's interesting hearing relation to both of those fields.
Yeah, and I think we can all experience it in real life. As I look back in my life, I'm not saying that's something I have thought about. I was like, Richard, you weirdo. You know, and what is your how does your brain work? So it's something I've contemplated a lot, and it's something that I advocate for. Is something that we don't talk about a lot, which is cognitive diversity. And even though, even in colleges they talk about, interdisciplinary this and that, it's still so siloed. I mean, and worse than before, because I've guest taught like fifth graders and whatnot, and they were asking them, oh, I'm going to be a neuroscience scientist. I'm what do you know in fifth grade what the hell you're going to study? Like, or what you even, so I think there's so many layers to that. And I always say, my math classes, almost every great function in life, right, or success involves using both sides of the brain, but we're never taught that, right? So, okay, you might not be doing calculus in poetry, but you are looking at structures of language. You're listening, poetry is very mathematical in some ways, right? Looking for patterns of logic, how to break that logic. And so it's almost like a poem to me feels like a geometric proof where you have a set of givens. Okay, my dog died. Like how do you move from line to line from image to image, and then come to some kind of conclusion or resolution or some kind of answer, figurative answer to that emotion. And so, and I do the same. I teach a class every once in a while at Wentworth University in Boston, which is an all engineering university. And I try to instill in them the idea that part of your success as an engineer is knowing the humanities and what's available to you, because at the end of the day, if you have, especially when you have public projects like as a civil engineer that I was, you have to be cognizant of a lot more than just math. You're building a project for a town. There's going to be 2 years of just meeting with the community, and you need feedback from them. They're going to tell you what is home to me. Like, I don't want that. I want this. Well, I remember when we did this. You're going to have to study the history of the place. You're going to have to study the psychology of people, why they say it, they resist everything at first. And anyway, I could go on forever, but I always instill in them that a good basis in the humanities is kind of applicable to any career and part of the success of any career. Because at the end of the day, a more aware human being is a better doctor, is a better lawyer, is a better engineer, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with humans, right? And what's worse is just, one of my pet peeves is how far away engineering has gotten from that as well. So that, I can see in Google headquarters a bunch of engineers who have no sense of who a user is, right? Because it's become more, same as happened with Facebook, right? It's become, okay, this is obviously for you techno guys, but not for the average grandma or even for me at 50. Like, why make this so complicated? So the humanities ultimately, I think, teach us if anything, they teach us one important thing: empathy. And that's the idea, not empathy in the way we think about it, but just the ability to step into somebody else's shoes and say, you know what? I'm not designing this car just for me. I'm designing it for someone else who's going to drive it. And to picture yourself in some ways, okay, what is important to that person, right? Or to that archetypal person, right? And so, I try, whenever they ask me to speak to STEM, I tell them, you're not going to like exactly what I have to say. I argue both sides of the coin, and I just, because sometimes the humanities get a little lost too, right? And so I love the idea of the public humanities, this is also one of my callings is just how can we make the humanities more alive, more present, more accessible, so that people value it in different ways, not just in some college classroom where it just becomes abstracted. So
I have so many things to say, but I'm like, we're gonna be here forever. But I think I'm thinking about like even just like geometry logics as like that's how problem solving works. Like even if it's not like modus tollens or like P and Q, like interacting with people is so many things to say. Yes. But let's pivot. We're talking about you and what you teach. Let's just go back for a second and talk about other jobs you had. So what were some of the major jobs you had since you were a teenager?
um, I had one, two, I guess, major jobs that were influential. One, I started working when I was 12 at my uncle's grocery store, a little Cuban grocery store, a little bodega. Uh, and that was, I can't begin to tell you how important that was. In ways that I didn't know at the time because I hated working there. And I was at 12, I meant 12, meaning I would work in the summers. And then, eventually it became my full-time, part-time job, like all through my college years and whatnot. So that was really important. For one, it taught me an incredible work ethic. All right. Two, I like to say it's where I learned to be Cuban. And by that, I mean that not learned to be Cuban, but appreciated my Cuban culture and heritage and understood it in real time, right? Like we were saying, the public humanities, it was happening right in front of me. So yeah, your parents tell you a story about this, about Cuba or whatnot, but you're like 12, or 13, you don't care, right? Like, I think there's a misunderstanding that children of immigrants or even immigrants themselves, when they're young, that they adore their given culture. They don't, for the most part, because it's just a generational thing. It's like whatever your parents represent, you're like, that's tacky. I don't want to do that. Um, but eventually there it was larger than my family, and being involved in the lives of not just my extended family, but all the people that come to that grocery store and their stories, and getting to know them over the years and hearing their stories about Cuba. I was like, wait a minute. So this Cuba is like a real thing. It's not some story that they start telling in Noche Buena after a few belts of rum, right? And so I appreciated that culture in ways that I had. It made it. I think it's like a whole chapter to. It runs a thread through my memoir about growing up in Miami. That's important. It was how important it was, and how many influential characters in my life that just made me rethink my own identity, or opened up a door to really embrace an identity that I didn't know was already mine, right? Like, because you kind of, it's there, but you just sort of don't access it. So that was really important. And then the other smaller job was, I became for a little while I was a library page, just like for a year. And basically, I just reshelved books at the library. But that was kind of interesting because um, I don't know, it added to that love of knowledge, because I always used to get in trouble because I just wouldn't put the books back. I'd sit in the aisles, like reading them. So, like reading about iguanas or like opera or like whatever else I felt like reading about. And it's less significant, but I think I always remember that job for contributing to that love of knowledge. And also, like we're talking about, like it's all connected and it's all important, and nothing's more important than the other. It's all, well, that's kind of what a library is. It's all of it is important. It's all in here.
I have something to say. Um, I when you were talking about how it was the generational bit, like I remember being younger and just like I had like a lot of attitude as a kid. I was like, like whatever, those are the good old days, like yada yada yada. And now, being in my mid 20s, I find myself like holding on and trying to figure out ways to learn how to be Dominican. Like speaking of, like I had this tote bag of like Cafe Bustelo that my friend made for me, and I'm like, whenever I go back home, because I'm in DC currently, whenever I go back home, I'm always ask my mom for one recipe for Dominican food so I can learn it and feel more like or to pick up on what I was ignoring as like an ignorant like middle schooler. So I definitely hear you. I feel myself like now trying to catch up in my mid 20s in the ways that I wasn't back then.
Yeah, yeah, same happened to me. And food was one thing. Yeah, I started learning a few recipes. You realize, when my mom goes, I'm never going to be able to have that food again. Of course, it will never come out the same as hers, but like, but yeah. So you go from this stage of catching up, and then also realizing that you also now become the keeper and the bridge of passing those things on as well, and sharing those things with others. So important.
Yeah, I'll just say I tried to make habichuela for the first time like 2 weeks ago, and it was just so disgusting, and it just didn't work out. And I'm like, learning. Now let's talk about your activism. And so by activism here, I mean any work or activities you've engaged in where your intention was to empower others. So it could have been your job, at a community-based organization or anywhere. So starting with your childhood to now, what change making based activism have you been involved in?
Sure. I think part of it really has been later in life. I do remember when I first, I don't want to say when I first came out, because when I first came out, I was terrified and didn't know much. But after I got very comfortable in leading an openly gay life, and presenting as gay, not just presenting as straight, and then having to tell you the real truth later. I started writing a little bit, doing op-ed columns, and at the time in Miami, we were working on an ordinance to secure housing rights against discrimination based on sexuality. And so I would do articles like that. I remember interviewing lots of iconic drag queens. I mean, we're talking South Beach in the 90s, right? Like, this is like insane, like, gay world, Disney world, right? But you know what? The truth is, like, I never felt empowered enough to sort of feel like I had something to say in some ways. I think the work itself became part of that. I think storytelling is in a way a form of activism. And so my three books are really just about bringing to light the life of immigrants, of exiles, and thinking about the complexities of identity, so that in some ways others that may be going through that, like maybe yourself, right? Like thinking about when you start that negotiation process. So I think that I've always looked at my art as a way to help other people. And I don't mean that in a sort of in a pretentious way. I just really, really, when I write, to me, the greatest compliment that someone can give me is that, to say to me, when I read your poem, it reminded me of when I. And so in some ways, that idea of the poem as a gift, as a poem that instills change in others, has always been very important. More so even after the inauguration, where I started to really understand, or I saw firsthand, I should say, the power of poetry in a much more public platform, and the role of the civic-minded or socially conscious poet. And so How to Love a Country, which was my most recent book, really pushed that edge a lot further. So I started to give myself permission to write about things that I wouldn't ordinarily write about, or wouldn't write about with such determination or passion. Things about race and call it racism and calling it out in sort of my own community, right? Or things about gender, standing up for gender equality, or also we did an anthology about sexual assault, thinking about things that I would have never dared to write. I would have never, not dared, it's not the right word. I just felt I had no, I couldn't participate in. And I realized, well, it's all where it comes from, right? If it's not appropriation, if it's coming in terms of honoring, or in terms of empowering, or in terms of calling to light certain things. And then within that context, I guess what I do most publicly, or I should say more publicly, is because of the inauguration as well, I realized how many people had such a poor understanding of poetry, such a misunderstanding of poetry. and yet how when they're given a chance with poetry, how incredibly powerful it becomes in their life. I mean, I was reading poems after the inauguration at the FDIC, and I was doing readings at Silicon Valley, and I was doing so all these audiences. That was the first time they ever even seen a living poet, right? And so I became. We created a position, a voluntary position at the Academy of American Poets, where I serve as education ambassador. And to me, it's about part of that role is to empower educators with different tools to explore poetry. But what I'm really sort of getting at through that is I want kids like me to have access to poetry and the humanities at a lot younger age, because I think you'll grow up more empowered and more self-aware for the things we're talking about. And I feel like that's my way of affecting that or causing change in that. I've also realized I am not the sort of marching kind of guy. I'm like kind of shy in that way. I'm not the guy that's going to go, from door to door canvassing. And I think it took me a while to be okay with that and realize that we all do what we can in the best ways, using what we do best. That's the most effective way. So I can empower. So I also, work with a lot of organizations and writing poems for them, or, creating fundraisers and speaking at them. So I use my gift of poetry as a gift in another way to empower those that know how to do that way better than I do.
So many things. I want to hear more about the inauguration as well. I have two things that were on my mind. First inauguration, and next, like I remember, I think when I was getting to research and getting into academia, I remember thinking about two creative pieces that like really shocked my world. I was thinking about Tongues Untied, Marlene Riggs' Tongues Untied, and this poem called The Litany to My Heavily Brown Body by a late trans artist named Mark Aguilar. And I think that those experiences activated me like intellectually, emotionally, and politically, I think more than other forms of content did, like a book or like an academic article. And so hearing about how like you want younger children to engage in poetry, I think poetry can unlock these things in more intimate ways than other genres and other mediums just don't, for whatever reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I think poetry has the power of music. And so that's where it comes from. And so what it is an appeal to some of our deepest emotions and psyche, the deepest parts of our psyche. And they stay with you just like a song, right? Like forever. And you'll read them again and again and again and again, just like you'll hear a song that means a lot to you over and over again, when you're feeling sad about that, or something. And so I think poetry in some ways does do that. And it's interesting because it's also lumped sort of into English class, but really it should be taught with music and drama and visual arts, because it has so much more, or I should say, impact in such a different way. Even when one is writing it, it's different, right? I mean, I go through a lot of it, emotional ringing myself. I always discover something important about myself when I finish a poem, or the world, or or someone in my life. And it has the power, again, of more like music than it does of just sort of storytelling. It's much more than storytelling.
And for this portion of the interview, I'd like to get your insights on some current events. I want to first talk about, we're in a pandemic still. So I wanted to get your observations on, like, do you notice any differences or similarities with how people are engaging COVID-19 in the past 2 years, similar to that of the HIV and AIDS crisis back in the 1980s and early 90s?
So I was a bit younger then, and I wasn't quite out during the AIDS crisis, so I wasn't as involved nor as aware, I should say. But I've done my own sort of going back to my gay history and sort of realizing, oh my God, this like learning some of history, like, and the denial of the disease, and then the how it got politicized too, right? So you can certainly see that that politicizing on the basis of discrimination, right? About an illness that eventually, we realized, oh, it's not just gay, right? This is it's a global crisis, right? So I saw that. I certainly see that horrible parallel, actually, how the idea of polarizing and using a disease to politically polarize people is just really just so unhuman. That's the word that comes to mind. So that's certainly part of what I've been thinking about. As far as the pandemic itself, on a very personal level, I kind of there's so many things you could say about that, but on the one hand, I think we see this in every kind of crisis or shifting moment or paradigm shift. We see the most beautiful things about human beings, and then the most ugliest things come up as well. So one of these things that I have personally sort of tried to focus on and have written about is that the pandemic has highlighted what I've always sort of believed philosophically, that each one of us counts and that each one of us contributes. And I don't mean just counts because you count. I mean that literally you count, right? So like knowing now that the most important person in the last year was the cashier at the grocery store, because they are putting their lives on the line for you to be able to buy groceries. And so suddenly you realize it was a very social equalizer for those of us that choose to see it that way. Suddenly the Amazon delivery person is like, whoa. Right? And so I hope that there are lessons that I hope we take into the future with us. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think there's been revelations in people. We have a workforce shortage. Partly it's because people have taken a great pause and said, you know what? I can do something else if I want, or maybe this isn't what I wanted to do, or maybe I'm worth more than what they're paying me to do this job. I am a bigger part of society, and makes society run in more ways than people had appreciated before. And there's been a certain empowerment in that. And I think that's obviously a good thing. So poets are weird because when things are going bad, we always look for the good things. And when things are going sort of good, we're like, what's messed up that we're not looking at? So I'm on the side right now, like looking at all these things, these lessons that I hope we take forward with us in that regard.
And I also want to ask for your opinion about, so last summer we saw a great increase visibly in protests against anti-Blackness and police brutality. Why do you think last summer and continued so, do you think that there was a greater response and attentiveness to the Black Lives Matter movement?
This is something that I've also given myself permission to write about in some poems and whatnot. And so I've thought about it both poetically, personally, and obviously just as an observer and seeing that what's happened, right? So I think there's a couple things to that. I think part of it is, I mean, a professor of students, from about 18 into their mid to late 20s. And part of it is generation, your generation, I guess, right? That have not bought into all the lies. Also we're a much more for despite all the fetters, we're a much more diverse society as a whole. And so, I think I was complicated. Sometimes I ask my students, like, are volunteering? They're like, no, my mom's Irish, then my dad's from Brazil, and my grandmother's Chinese from Puerto Rico. And you're like, what? So how do you identify? They're like, I don't know, everything. So I think there's a certain your generation, and I see that it keeps me alive when I see that kind of, and not a naive version either, but just really understanding that, again, there's there's something larger, and that our history has been full of lies and great ideals. And let's separate the ideals from the lies. The ideals are still there, and I think those are very powerful, and we don't need to throw them away. It's more the way we go about or interpreting those ideals that has changed from time to time, and now we're realizing how far away we are from those ideals. So I think that's part of what we're happening. To put it in a much more sort of, I guess, intellectual basis, I just think, and we know this, right? I know this from Cuba. I know this from the Dominican Republic. We're still dealing with, in many ways, the same idea. I feel like America is finally going through their post-colonial history. Like they're finally dealing with all the effed up things that they've been doing. Because in a way, and when you look at it, for me, it feels like, yeah, we were colonists and whatnot, but really, in some ways, the same systems stayed in place, right? With another great layer, right? I don't deny that America is still sort of one of the greatest experiments in the world, right? Social experiments. But of course, that all depends on its execution, right? Like, and so we're finally dealing with our, history of slavery and racism that built this country, and we're finally sort of, in a way, it does feel like sort of an internal revolution, right? Like, in a way, like we've seen in Cuba and Dominican Republic, we're dealing with it, and so. That's the way I sort of have framed it. And I think also the way I've given myself permission, I think one of the most beautiful things is that other people have realized, racism is not someone else's problem. Right? It's not Black people's problem. Racism, it's the victims of racism, but they didn't create the problem. The idea is that we got to step up because this is us. This is not about, one can have this sort of armchair sort of liberal sort of sensibility about racism, right? But no, you can't just say, well, that's really bad, I can't believe that. No, you got to step up, and I think people are finally realizing that. I remember during the Muslim ban, when Trump first took office, and also during all the protests that we saw before and post George Floyd, it wasn't just Black people. It wasn't just Black people of a certain age. It was all over, right? People of all colors, all nationalities, genders, and I was like, suddenly these little white boys were protesting, right? Like you wouldn't have seen that even in the 60s, right? You wouldn't have seen that. So that I think is different. And I think we're seeing that has made a difference when everybody sort of joins forces and not just, not just sort of passes on the buck or, figures it's someone else's problem to fix.
And thinking more theoretically, what do you think needs to happen for the world to become more inclusive for LGBTQ plus people, for people of color, and for those who identify as both?
This is where I don't have an undergraduate degree in the humanities, which might help. But I always come back to mind to something. I don't know the exact historical details of it, and it was more in conversation. But as I remember talking about that, and this may have happened in other countries, but in this particular conversation was about Great Britain, when there was a formal apology and a formal reconciliation for their history. And what's the other word? Not just reconciliation.
Reparations.
Reparations. And I think that ultimately that's what needs to happen. Like that is, we're still, I don't know that we have, maybe we have, but it's certainly not been on the news that I remember. But I think that just coming clean, and I mean, by coming clean, I mean everybody coming clean and say, you know what, this is our history. And it's, also a sense of, I guess, self-forgiveness in some ways, in some ways, the idea that it's not that it's okay, but all countries have their dark history, but it's what you do with that and how you move forward with that really counts at the end of the day, because name a country that doesn't have a few marks on their a few demerits on their list, right? Beginning with England, right? So I think that would be so powerful in that way. And we thought having an African American president kind of did that, I mean, certainly every little bit helps, but we saw right after that there's still that seething racism that we were right, the Civil War was just, and that slavery is still an institution that can be defended in some way. That's what's still happening. And so by defending that history, you're also defending the very idea of slavery, right? And so slavery makes itself into, we all know, makes itself into other. So what is our system of incarceration except another substitute, right, for that kind of ideology, right? And so I think I don't know that to me, I don't know how that would look like or when it would happen, but a coming together and a coming clean and just saying let's acknowledge this and move on. And of course, now we're trying to teach critical race theory and it's being butted up against, fought against. So I don't know what that would look like, and I don't know if that's something that can be sort of masterminded, but that it's something that has to happen sort of perhaps, I want to say organically, but that has to happen naturally, has to sort of be part of what we really believe and not just say or force on others that don't believe it.
Yeah, and I think that I definitely agree with you. I think that considering COVID-19 a paradigm shift really like pulls us all in. I think that in some ways, like some people did not need the United States to be forthright and say what it's accountable to. I think the world in many ways revealed itself and the states did reveal themselves. But I think it's kind of is what's led to mass numbers of protests, mass number of critiques, and I think we're getting on our way. I cannot imagine the day that our leaders take accountability for what they're doing globally, but I do think the world is getting more honest. Even if like our leaders are not making that kind of statement, I think a lot of us are living in truth and not waiting for that agreement. But I'm very curious to like when the world or when our leaders would finally take accountability in other ways that countries have.
Yeah, and I think there's been a confluence of things that have just information, historical events, generational shifts that are on the precipice of what is kind of a kind of almost a global paradigm change. I mean, everything, and even our idea of work and whatnot, or who we are and how do we function in society has been being rethought. It's the old Confucian curse, right? May you live in interesting times. I got to say though, like it might get worse before it gets better, and I think, but that's part of what we just need to be aware of, right? That it's a big growing pain, but I'm the eternal optimist too, and it's something that I might not see in my lifetime, but it's. I always think about countries with really long histories, like someone like Great Britain or Spain or whatnot. I'm like, we've seen nothing yet. Like it's like we've done pretty good for 250 plus years. Actually, I'd like to sometimes say, like, look, in my own lifetime, from having Robert Frost be inaugural poet, one of the whitest men possible, right? To having a gay immigrant, working class kid become or be selected. There's progress, but we sometimes take 2 steps back, 4 steps forward, 20 steps back. But that's all part of history and how history runs its course. One of the things I've been saying lately that may add to this is I've been saying lately, or I've realized myself, that democracy is not a noun, but that it's a verb. And I think that idea has been has shifted, right? The idea is like, we don't live in a democracy. I mean, we don't have a democracy. We participate in one. And the minute you don't, then what do you call it, right? So the idea is that it's a constant work in progress, that is something you have to participate in. It's not like, oh, we live in a democracy. Isn't it great? Let's hold hands. Even in the longest democracies in the world, there's still always the possibility of a collapse, right? Because we can take it for granted. And I think we've just kind of thought, oh, America, freedom and justice for all, and one country to the thee, and yada yada. We live in a democracy. Uh, you participate. It's a verb. It's not a noun. It's not a one and done. And we kind of all thought that, right? Like that's how I was educated. Oh yeah, this whole thing changed the world, and we're all live free, and like this is like the best country in the world. So the idea of American exceptionalism is sort of big blown out the window too, because it's like, okay, now it's not working the way it was supposed to work.
Yeah, and especially like when people were like, I think Trump getting reelected, and then I'm gonna pivot, but like getting reelected, I was very interested in like the ridicule that the United States was getting globally, and I'm like, this first of all definitely pokes a hole in this notion of like an American exceptionalism. But I think to see his election as an embarrassment, as like a moral and ethical embarrassment, was a very interesting kind of discipline that I didn't think, or accountability that I didn't think could ever be inflicted on the United States. But I really enjoyed like the global discourse of like mocking this country, because yes, it was an embarrassment, but it was a very interesting way to hold this country accountable for sure.
Yeah, and you see that, like, right? Like, you supposedly are this great experiment, and you promise this whole idea to the world, and you haven't been doing your job as well as you could have.
And for this final portion of our interview, I'd like to switch things back to you personally. So, if you could speak to your 20-year-old self today, what advice would you give him?
That's always kind of like, I always want to say it'll get better, right? Because of that. Remember that it's still around, right? That campaign, advertising campaign of speaking to young gay youth, so LGBTQ youth. But let me think about that a little bit more, and beyond that. Um, I guess I would just say, you know what? Honestly, it may not be that deep, but I would just say, like, you're not weird. Like, or you're weird, but it's actually great that you're weird, because this is exactly what's going to ensure you're not ensure, but what's going to make you happiest and most fulfilled in life, and going to lead you to amazing things. So don't ever feel like your weirdness is a liability or a handicap, but rather a strength. And the weirder you are, the better. Like, so, because I always felt weird, and I always felt, and not just because of being gay, right? Like, but also, like we were talking about earlier, and being Cuban and not feeling I'm American either. And what does this mean? And why do I hate my Cuba? Then why do I love Cuba? Then why is it that I'm an engineer and I'm quite in LA? Why is it that, so all those kinds of weirdnesses, I've learned, I guess, in my lifetime, that that's the source of my strength, not my liability. Um, and I didn't feel that way till I still don't feel that way sometimes, but I didn't feel that way until probably like my good mid-30s, where I really started saying, hey, you know what? This is good. I would also say, like, I guess the one thing I also learned over time that I would say back to myself is there are no mistakes. And I know that sounds very Oprah, but being, again, when you feel like the other, right? When you feel the other because you're gay or because you're Cuban, or like you're always feeling like that your success, or whether lack of success, is because you made a mistake, right? We feel defective, whether like there's a thing that, that second guessing or that doubting, Um, but that, for years I felt weird as hell about being an engineer and a poet, right? I mean, I had this conversation with you, but it took me a while to say, you know what, like, no, that wasn't a mistake. I wasn't supposed to study poetry, and I didn't. Like, I was supposed to study engineering, and I was supposed to then do poetry. Um, so those two things are kind of related. The idea of don't worry about being weird, and also there are no mistakes. Every little thing leads to another, and leads to another, and leads to another, and and you never know what those connections are. And what seems like a mistake to you today might be actually the greatest move you ever made in your life. You just don't know that yet.
And what advice would you give me? I'm a 25-year-old fat queer femme Dominican pursuing a doctorate. So any advice for me?
Don't think you're weird. um, I guess it's hard because I don't know you obviously as well only through this interview. I think what so I mean, I don't know how you're feeling or what you're lacking, and it's a big broad question, right? But what I'm feeling sort of relates to our earlier question. Just talking to you today has taught me something very important that I just go Baez, it's like, okay, Joe, like, so I didn't know anything about you, and then suddenly here you are, and you're Dominican, you got a Bustelo bag, right? And you're lifting your straps, So I think one of the most beautiful things your generation does, and perhaps also a source of your own doubt, and again, and feeling of weirdness and oddness. Um, you're really teaching us in the world like this idea of intersectionality, and so on the one hand, sometimes that message gets sliced very thin. Oh, it's like I'm non-binary or I'm this or I'm that. Actually, if we look at what's happening in the world, the whole world is going non-binary. Look at what's happening in genres of writing. What's a poem anymore? What's the difference between flash fiction and a prose poem? Right? What's the difference between, and I think your generation in some ways must feel terribly empowered by that and at the same terrified by that. So I would say, again, use that as a strength and realize that you're moving with the world and helping the world move in a direction that needs to move in. And so even when you think about intersectionality in terms of the virus, right, there is no border to the virus. We have to understand our intersections, right? We have to understand that there's no such, this idea of a neat little country with borders that, oh, I'm this, like that just is not that kind of false dichotomy or binary doesn't exist anymore, because you can get on a plane and be anywhere in the world in 12 hours, right? So we are interconnected. There's all those neat little definitions have been washing away more and more, and I think it's culminated in your generation. My advice would you is just take that larger message too. Obviously every message comes from a font of personal experience, but like also, yeah, that expand on that message so that the world understands that, it's more than just it's more than just saying X or this or that, right? And I gotta tell you, I'm a bit older than you. Obviously, sometimes that message is a little confusing, or doesn't. We don't always understand exactly what is being represented. Or I've learned a lot more from my students. I mean, every time I leave my classroom, I'm like, holy shit! I thought I was cool. Like being gay is not like a thing anymore. Like, and so know that you're on the right side of history, I guess, more than history, on the right side of, I think, where humanity's consciousness needs to move to, or is going to move to naturally.
Yeah, and I it's interesting thinking about labels and like definitions that are washing away, because I feel like the ways that like younger people are embodying queerness and transness today is almost without the label. Like there's that discourse about labels are outdated, but I think even beyond that, I think people are just thinking about queerness in ways that are so creative. Like I came out as gay, and I'm like thinking about gayness today. I'm like, that's not like a gayness seems, let me find the word. Like people like I almost felt like outdated in a sense, like identifying as gay in 2021, because I think people's embodiment of like queer has been very much like we're trying to transcend like these kinds of labels that people think might be outdated. And I think it's beautiful that there's queer and there's gay, and while some people might have like attitudes towards one or preferences towards one, people are like getting so creative and so inspiring.
Yeah.
My students are queer in ways that I was not queer back in college or high school. So I'm definitely like learning from younger folks as well, even being 25.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's done so in a very mutually respecting way, which has I've seen that hasn't always been in the past. Like even in the early days of we're queer, we're here. This idea that there's an us and them, and it's just that even that was kind of a binary, like a false binary, like and like specifically, like I was socialized as a straight man, so like and a straight Latino man, so like you put me in a room with a bunch of uh, hetero Cuban people, and sometimes I feel more at home there than if you put me in some bar in Provincetown with all, like, but that's okay. You do your thing, but like, and so like for me, the idea of like sort of queer Cuban and all the big fat mess all rounded up together, men dancing with men, women dancing with men, and just that. So yeah, and so like there's all these kinds of false boundaries that we create for ourselves, and so yeah, bringing that all into light and knowing that you don't have to, and yet you can if you want. Like, hey, I do this, and that's fine too, and we can respect that as well. So,
And concerning your life activism and perspective, is there anything that we have not talked about that you'd like to talk about now?
um, and we covered a lot of ground. I just trying to think. I just want to sort of talk a little bit about what I feel my work keeps on coming back to over and over again, and also how it keeps evolving in different aspects or dimensions. And so the idea of home is a big sort of placeholder for me. And first, it really literally meant home in terms of cultural identity and Cuban or American, and like what did that mean? And so many different fluctuations and ways of thinking about that. Um, and I guess I won't bore you with the details, but in some ways, home is even in terms of your sexuality, right? Is a connection to home that need to have community, place, support system. We were talking about family the family you find outside of your given family. I find it's the one thing that, as they say, like every poet is writing one poem of their life, and to me, that's that poem of home and all the dimensions to it. And what I've realized is of late, I was thinking of home also not just in terms of my own biographical experiences or autobiographical experiences, I should say, but what is home to us as a nation? Who are we? What is home to the we? And again, asking those bigger questions. Okay, it's not just about I'm a Cuban or I'm American. No, what is a country? Well, the book is called How to Love a Country, which is really asking like, what is a country anymore, too, right? So the idea of also now home being a global sense of home, right? The idea of being a global citizen, of connecting and realizing, again, like we were talking about how all these things are vanishing. That's another thing that's not that easy anymore, right? And how the interconnectedness of our lives. And then when you think about it too, even climate change dives into that because, or like the virus, right? The virus doesn't stay. Like, I just love how now they're having, Florida's spiking. Well, so will you in like a few months or a few weeks, because the virus doesn't stop at the border. It doesn't say, you know what, it's really hot and it's really cold up north. I'm going to stay down in Florida. So we're seeing more and more that, in a way, this gets really into deep sort of philosophical or Carl Sagan kind of, we're really sort of evolving as a species into one home, one place, and one people, right? And so it's sort of the idea of the American democracy exploded to the idea of like, this is really, I won't say it in my lifetime, obviously, but our survival as a species may depend on that kind of what's no longer necessary, maybe what would be more of a cognitive evolution than just a hunting, like or growing feathers or whatnot, or changing colors. But rather that if we don't change the way we think, that ultimately is our survival. But again, even that to me is the idea of home has sort of become bigger and more complex, or I should say, keeps finding a home in different things. Kind of keeps on connecting to this thing that happened from a very personal, very autobiographical point of view, and started growing more and more.
And even thinking about the pandemic, like when I think about home and thinking about the order to stay at home, like that can be such an ambivalent, like people have such changing relationships to home now. I remember like when I was quarantined in Brooklyn over what I thought was a spring break from school, I really had like a really difficult time being at home. And it made where I am now, Washington, DC, it's like raining here. Um, it made I had to like reinvent what I thought of home, because now home was my workplace. Home was also where I was going to be for X amount of time. Um, Home was also now like a safe space where I didn't want to bring anything inside that could kill us and my roommates. And so thinking about that and like what does home mean, what did our quarantines look like, and how did our quarantines affect us, is something that we're still like living through.
Yeah, that's I've thought very much along those lines. Uh, there's a poem I wrote that didn't have to do with the pandemic, but it's called Imaginary Exile. And it was centered on this idea of, what if, like my mother, let's say you had to get up and leave your home and everything you knew like in 24 hours, right? Like, and the pandemic taught me that, we always think of home as, the four walls we live in, and then it's our respite from the rest of the world. And that's not home. This is home. And now that we're home, there's this great irony. I realize, no, home is everything because we need it all. And home is just one of those components, like your actual physical home. And we do need that privacy sometimes. But then when that's, cut off from the rest of the world, you realize, oh my God, like suddenly, the grocery store is home and a park is home. Even being out in nature I remember because the gyms were closed. I was living in my mom's house in Miami at the time, just walking around the neighborhood that I grew up in, that I had never bothered to realize this whole 5 square blocks is my home. It always has been, right? It's been part of my experience. And so it forced us out, it forced us back in. It was just fascinating, all the ways in which home redefined or shifted around for us.
Yeah, I have two final questions and then our time is up. Um, so we spent our time today talking about your history. I'd like to switch to a question about your legacy. At your memorial service, what would you like people to say about you, your life, and your legacy?
Sure. So interesting. That's kind of the kind of stuff I'm writing about now. Not a literal death, but I've gone really out with the idea of home, big ideas of country, and now realizing the home of the body, right? Like how every experience of home is somehow housed in our body, right? And so I've been was circling around writing poems like that, like my last will, um, a poem about a time capsule of what I would leave in a time capsule, which is of course all poetic and not, all figurative, but I gotta be honest with you. I think this might sound a little cliche, but I think it's this, like I was saying earlier, it's the same ultimate impetus of my poetry is to make someone else understand themselves, to let someone else understand themselves and the world about them a better place. So I feel like if that the work that I do by personal inventory, by intellectual exploration or whatnot, that if I that's ultimately the gift I want to leave the world, whether that's a poem or a whole body of work or whatnot, that that people would understand, that came away from my life understanding theirs better. And I think I don't know exactly where that comes from. I'm not that nice of a guy all the time. I'm not like Mr. Buddha walking around all day. I'm kind of a pain in the butt sometimes. But ultimately, my deepest parts of myself, I think that's what keeps me writing and living, is to bring in some ways joy and understanding to others, not in a pretentious way, but in a way because as an example of showing and sharing what I've had to work through in my work and my poems and what those things mean. And yeah, I think that's ultimately how I'd like to be remembered quietly in everyone's hearts for something that happened, a poem they connected with, a moment that they understood something other than just me, because obviously I ended up understanding my life too, but like that's not really the point.
And that's reminding me of we started off talking about education. And I think in some ways, like there's education we get through traditional schooling and through people around us, but like, and through your work and through poetry, but this is also from education.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
getting other people to find themselves again is like, yeah, it's very full circle.
yeah. That's the ultimate bedrock of education, right? I mean, it's about learning your times tables, but it's really about empowering people to understand about themselves and who they can be in this world, right? And that they're what they think and what they feel matters, right? Matters to them first of all. They should know that, and then to the rest of the world. Yeah.
And that's all I have. Again, thank you so much for your time. I
Great job.
greatly appreciated this.
Where are you in DC, Joe?
I'm in Southeast DC. So I'm gonna stop recording.